Hi, Ali. As the assistant engineering professor with the University of St. Thomas, your research has helped uncover the massive financial burden of PFAS cleanup across different regions. Me and my whole team are huge, massive fans of you and your work, and we're all really excited to be able to learn from you today. So, first of all, thank you for joining us in this discussion today, and really excited to learn more from you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm happy to be here and talk with you about this.
So the most important question, the elephant in the room, why PFAS and what made you interested in this topic?
Yeah, I wish I had some noble goal here, but the truth is the thing that got me into PFAS is that I was a consultant in industrial wastewater treatment and someone hired me to look at PFAS. So that's kind of where I started, but it kind of after the fact now that I'm working on it, I think PFAS are very interesting because they're so persistent. Like that's the
Yeah.
thing that makes them so different than other chemicals we think about. And I think it means that we have to change the way that we think about chemical pollution because it's not just about cleaning up the stuff that we've done in the past. Because they're so persistent, all of the things that we do today is going to matter for the generations in the future. And so I think it's a really good opportunity to
Yeah.
rethink how we manage chemicals in our human systems.
Perfect. So that brings me to the really interesting aspects of your work, which is really around the costs of this PFAS remediation today. Can you share more about your latest work with the Forever Pollution Project, where the estimation of costs for decontaminating Europe was covered? And if you could also talk us through what were the costs, different key cost scenarios that you were looking into?
Yeah, so I worked with a team of investigative journalists on the Forever Pollution Project. And the follow-up to that is the Forever Lobbying Project, and these cost estimates are part of that. So the team of journalists led by Le Monde, they recruited me as well as Hans-Peter Arp from the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute to help estimate the costs based on our experience. So I had past experience in estimating costs for PFAS treatment in wastewater effluent and wastewater biosolids. Hans Peter had more experience in the soils part. So um, we tried to estimate costs of remediating PFAS in streams that might be targeted by future efforts. It was a little challenging because I think we all know that we can't clean up all the PFAS that's out there
Mhm.
in the environment. It's everywhere. It's too dilute, and it would just be way too expensive to do that. So we tried to highlight specific sources and media that we have information about, and we looked at two specific scenarios. So first, the legacy scenario is meant to reflect past emissions of PFAS, and it's meant to address long chain PFAS that are currently regulated in some way or another. So things like PFOA, PFOS.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the baseline. And then we added in an emerging scenario, and that is meant to address PFAS from ongoing and future emissions. And it's also meant to address the whole range of PFAS, including TFA for the most part, which is kind of the most mobile and difficult to remove one. So the difference between those two scenarios, I think, reflects the potential for use restrictions in the EU and the world. So if we put use restrictions in and they're effective, then maybe we can get by with a legacy scenario.
Mhm.
If we don't have use restrictions, we might need some aspects of the emerging scenario in terms of if we wanted to remediate PFAS in the environment.
Mhm. Sounds like a really, really big project. I mean, when the data came out a couple of weeks ago, it was very interesting for the likes of me to dive deeper. If I'm not wrong, the estimates were 100 billion per year for Europe, if I'm not wrong. And for like a 20-year project, we're talking about like 2 trillion per year to the EU economy. So really staggering data points. Do
Yes.
you think that's like a very good estimate, or are we still like scratching somehow the tip of the surface here? And how do you see that price tag, which sounds really massive already
It is
initially?
massive. It does sound massive. And I think there's a lot of nuances here. So there's not like a right answer to this question. It
Mhm.
kind of depends on what assumptions you make and what we included. And that's all documented in the Forever Lobbying Project website. Um, but yeah, so the legacy estimate is $100 billion over 20, sorry, 100 billion euros over 20 years. And then the emerging estimate, which takes into account kind of more PFAS and more sources, would be more like 100 billion per year, basically forever until we stop making them. Um, so I think those are kind of the right order of magnitude if we wanted to remediate PFAS in the environment. I think what we're trying to say with this work is not necessarily that we should remediate PFAS in the environment. I think what we're trying to say is that it's too expensive to do that, and so we should be shifting our focus away from trying to take it out once it's in the environment to trying to limit how much is getting into the environment. And to
Yeah.
me, that means two things. That means use restrictions, like the EU REACH proposal, and it also means limiting emissions at concentrated sources where we need PFAS. So industrial wastewater emissions, industrial air emissions, landfill leachate. If we can focus on reducing those emissions and uses, then hopefully we don't have to do as much remediation of the environment where it's more expensive and more dilute and more challenging.
Mhm. That's fascinating. Was there anything that surprised you in the course of your work on this massive project?
Yeah, I think we were expecting the wastewater treatment and the soil remediation all to be super expensive, and that's what came out. But one of the things that surprised me was what a good deal it seemed like to treat landfill
Mhm,
leachate. And partly because there's a lot of landfills, but they're generally pretty small, and the volume of leachate they produce is really small compared to wastewater or some of these bigger streams. So
mhm,
if we're trying to think about limiting PFAS going to the environment, landfill leachate ends up being a really cost-effective place to treat it. And we didn't look at industrial wastewater just because we didn't have the data on industrial wastewater plants in Europe, but I suspect that would be a similar
mhm,
good deal where you get a lot of PFAS mass removed per cost invested. So
mhm,
there's this cost about removing PFAS in the environment, but some of those kind of in between locations where if you can limit how much is going to the wastewater treatment plant from industrial wastewater, from landfill leachate, you get a lot more bang for your buck. You get a lot more benefit for euro spent
definitely.
there if you can target those smaller streams that have much higher concentrations of PFAS in them.
Yeah. I mean, from that perspective, the industrial water treatment, decentralizing it probably, it even makes even more sense, right? Because sometimes you could be looking at ppm, hundreds of ppm level
Yes.
concentrations of PFAS. And the leachate is much lower. In many cases, it could be much lower as well. So
Yes.
obviously, as close as possible to the diffuse source, the concentrated source, the better.
Yes.
Which is always a very interesting conversation to have in the aspects of, okay, accountability and policy. And we get that too in a bit as well. But I'm reflecting on something that you mentioned in the past, which was you mentioned that the cost comparisons need to be framed in the context of what you're buying.
Yes.
Why is that important for us to do that?
I think it's especially important for things like PFAS because there's just not enough money in the world to remediate PFAS. I had a paper in 2024 where I compared the um, the current the current emissions of PFAS into the environment, and if we were to remove them from the environment at that rate, it would cost more than the global GDP. So it's just there's literally not enough money in the world to manage
Mhm,
PFAS from the environment. So I think because there's not enough money to do everything, we really need to think about our decision making and figure out where are the places where we want to manage PFAS as a society, and where of those places can we spend our money to get the most benefit. So things that the way I typically present this is like cost per benefit. And the benefits that we're often looking at for drinking water are health risk reduction. So there's a pretty direct health risk reduction if you're not drinking as much PFAS in your water.
yeah.
The types of benefits we're looking at for things like landfill leachate and wastewater treatment and wastewater sludges is more on the mass of PFAS that's routed to the environment. So I typically will present treatment costs as either cost per health risk reduction if it's
Uh-huh.
a drinking water situation, or costs per mass of PFAS removed and destroyed if it's like a waste treatment. And so that's if you're comparing it in terms of cost per mass of PFAS, that's where you get to where the leachate and the industrial wastewater treatment are a really good deal when you compare it to something like wastewater treatment, where PFAS is a lot more diluted. You need to treat a lot more volume of water to get to the same amount of mass.
Hmm. That makes sense. And now talking about the cost as well, and going back to the really important topic, um, when we talk about the costs of PFAS cleanup or even the treatment on concentrated sources, how do you view like who pays for that? How should we share this burden? And I guess I'm looking at it from both scenarios, right? So legacy pollution, but also maybe the active daily pollution. So can you share your thoughts on how can we look at the two different scenarios differently? Should it be shared between the polluters, or let's say the governments, or like the other stakeholders like the public? And would this burden, should it look differently, the sharing of this ratio of costs, if it's a legacy pollution or if it's a more direct daily pollution like caused by an industrial customer?
Yeah, these are really good questions, and I think especially with legacy pollution, it can be challenging to,
Mm,
uh, get polluters to pay for that because there weren't necessarily regulations at the time when the pollution happened.
mm,
Um, I think one thing that is often overlooked with PFAS is that we're still making and using a lot of PFAS in consumer and industrial products today. And so there's a lot of talk about legacy pollution. To me, yes, legacy pollution is a problem, but the big thing we should be focusing on is what are we doing from today forward? Because we're still making and using so much of them. Anything we can do today to restrict their use and emissions is going to have huge impacts for the future. So in terms of who pays, I think we all agree that everyday people shouldn't have to pay with higher water bills and higher wastewater bills, which
mm,
is unfortunately, I think where the bill is going to land if we try to treat it in those locations. Um, I think the farther upstream we can go, the more the cost is going to go to the people who are actually using it and putting it in products. So I've talked about use restrictions and emissions reductions. So use restrictions, if companies are trying to identify PFAS and phase them out, then those companies would bear some of those costs. And then presumably some of the consumers who buy their products would also bear some of those costs.
mhm,
It's similar with emissions reductions. If we're doing industrial wastewater treatment or more air treatment, again, it's going to be the companies that are making and using them, and then through parts of the economy, some of their consumers as well. So I
mhm.
think as much as we can move them upstream, then not only does it move the costs to where it's more equitable, but it also will reduce the costs.
Yeah.
There haven't been a lot of studies on exactly how much it's going to cost to phase PFAS on things. I know ECHA is working on some of that, but it's not going to be more than the global GDP. So,
Mm,
which is how much it would cost if we try to remove it once it's out there. So,
yeah.
by moving it upstream, we're moving who pays, but we're also greatly reducing the costs.
True. Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting key finding, which I'm sure people would love to dig into, right? Um, any lessons that you can share, that policymakers can take from your amazing research here, to know how they can better regulate PFAS now then that they have this data from your findings?
Yeah, and I think the main thing is that cleaning up PFAS once it's in the environment is very expensive, and
Mm,
it's more likely to fall to everyday people. Whereas if we can restrict the use and emissions through policies, it's going to be less expensive and more just in terms of who pays.
mhm. Um, and in the same direction, what are your views on having a ban in industries? Is it still something that you think the industries that are reliant on PFAS, where they just simply can't replace it tomorrow? So how could we shape the narrative around reducing it now from an active discharge source, where they do need
Yeah.
to keep actively using PFAS to make, medical devices or semiconductor chips or firefighting foams and all of these areas where we don't really have good replacements today. So what can those polluters or discharges do to help us in this problem?
Yeah, I that's a very good question. And I think with a ban, I don't think it needs to be an all or nothing approach. I
Mm,
don't think a total ban is a reasonable expectation right now for a lot of those industries. I think there are still a lot of essential uses. But that doesn't mean that we can't restrict uses in places where we have alternatives. So yes, there are some industries that should have derogations and exceptions where they can continue to use PFAS, ideally with uh, time limited exceptions with to support ongoing R&D to eventually have alternatives in those spaces. So
mm,
100% we need to start limiting PFAS in places where we have alternatives. If we don't have alternatives, I think continuing to use PFAS there makes sense, at least for a while until we can find them. And I think that's where the reducing emissions becomes really
yeah,
key.
yeah.
So if you have a semiconductor plant that's using PFAS in the semiconductors, okay, But let's make sure that we're really clamping down on the wastewater emissions, on the air emissions from those plants, so that we're
Mm,
destroying anything that's leaving the plants that's not in the product itself.
true. True. So we're talking about better waste management of the concentrated PFAS laden water or air. So they can do that as long as there are critical applications where there is no replacement, but the treatment or the no discharge from there is then a no brainer. That needs to be enforced
Yes.
strongly as well.
Yes.
Mhm.
Agreed.
Are there any states or any countries or regions that you feel are doing a good job with the PFAS phase out, but also maybe also with the cleanup and remediations, and anything that we can as a society learn from those places?
I think that there are kind of I'll give 2 kind of, extreme
Mm,
examples. I think, the EU is doing a really great job with the REACH restrictions. I think that's a strong proposal, especially with the derogations that are proposed. And I know
mhm,
the European Chemical Agency, ECHA, is doing an ongoing evaluation of the different sectors where PFAS is used to better understand essential uses. I think that's a good approach. I think trying to understand all of those nuances before the restriction is put in place is good because I think that will help make it a more reasonable proposal from the start in terms of where are the essential uses and where can they be removed.
mhm,
So that's one place where that I think is good. My home state of Minnesota in the United States has a ban that kind of just skipped that whole process. So there's a restriction in Minnesota. It's currently restricted in 11 product categories for intentionally added PFAS, and then by 2032, the law says that PFAS that are not essential cannot be sold in Minnesota.
mhm.
And there's a lot of uncertainty still about what will be essential, what will be accepted, what will be exceptions and such. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. And I think there's a lot of work that's still needed here to understand what those exceptions are, but also for companies to understand where PFAS is coming into their supply chain and where it
Yeah.
is. And I think there's just a lot of unknowns there. So
Mm,
on one hand, I think the European approach of like thinking it all through before we do it is helpful. But on the other hand, I like kind of like Minnesota's approach of like, let's put in a ban, let's put the rule in and we'll figure it out as we go. Cause that is really driving,
yeah.
uh, trying to figure out how to make this work. So it's good to think through it, but it's also in some places, sometimes we'll just need the regulation in place to drive advancements to figure out how to actually make this work.
Yeah, I'm completely with you on that as well. I think what ECHA is doing and EU is doing is great work, but this could also like take forever, I feel, forever, to solve this forever chemical crisis. And I don't think we have the luxury to wait that long. But then also implementing something and having that in place, which might not be sustainable for future, is also something. And maybe there's a middle ground in between these two
Yeah.
extremes, right? Where
Yes.
there is hope for other countries to also like learn from. Um, what are your views over the new France PFAS ban that came out a couple of weeks ago now, like limiting or reducing or banning PFAS actually from cosmetics and non-essential products, and the terminology of €100 per 100 kg of PFAS emission?
Yeah.
What do you think of that? I'm really curious about that number.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. I think, I think it's a good start. I think there are a lot of sectors with available alternatives that weren't included in that restriction. For
Mhm.
example, the cookware.
Yeah.
Cookware is not included in that use restrictions.
True.
And there are a lot of alternatives available. So
Yeah.
mm, I think it's a good start, but I think there are more sectors and PFAS uses that need to be included in the future. I think they do have this monetary
Mm.
number that they've put on, PFAS emissions, like, as a kind of a fee for people who aren't complying, and I like that idea, and I think it reflects the cost per mass issue of when you take something out of the environment, here's how much it costs. I do think it's kind of an I think it's a good start, but I also think it's an underestimate, so I think it was
Yeah.
do you know what the number was?
I think it's €100 per 100 kg of
Okay,
PFAS.
I something like that, I think, but in my work on the cost to remove a kilogram of PFAS from the environment using given typical technologies today is about €1,000,000 or more,
Yeah.
depends on the technology and where it is, but €1,000,000 per kilogram. So the fee that the French, ban is on there is a lot less than that.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that we can get it up to 100 to €1,000,000 per kilogram in this initial round of the fee, but I think understanding that yes, that fee is probably a good start, but it really does underestimate the costs of removing PFAS once it gets out into the environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was wondering as well, if it does not give the polluters a great incentive to put 100 kgs of PFAS unchecked and pay €100 for that. So that's always like a mixed bag as well. Like if it's incentivizing polluters to sort of pollute with a blank, a very sort of legal way of doing that, right? So that's
Yeah,
also how
but
my thoughts were.
if it's not high enough, then it's not really worth the company's time to remove it.
Yeah. Well, maybe looking a little bit into the future as well. So what are the biggest knowledge gaps in the PFAS research today, according to you?
Yeah, and there's a ton of great work being done in PFAS, especially in kind of technologies and policy. I think um, I think one of the biggest gaps that I have is trying to figure out how we actually make these PFAS restrictions happen. So there's a lot of focus on PFAS in the environment and PFAS in drinking water and PFAS in those types of things. But if we look at the picture of how humans are exposed to PFAS, it's about 20% in drinking water. This is just average Americans, but I think it's probably
Mm,
similar to average Europeans. It's about 20% in drinking water. It's about half in the food that you eat, and that
mm,
comes from pesticides, it comes from food packaging, it comes from atmospheric deposition and soil uptake, a bunch of things in the food. And then a large amount of the remainder is from dust inhalation from your house and in your businesses. So to me, what that means is that about half of the intake is from sources that are out in the environment, and about
mhm,
half of it is a result of products that you buy and bring into your house.
uh-huh.
So if we're focusing a lot on removing PFAS from the environment, that only accounts for about half of
Yeah.
current exposure, and it accounts for a lot less of future exposure because future exposure is going to be more a function of what we're making and emitting right now.
Yeah.
So the focus on remediation and treatment and that kind of stuff, I think that's helpful, but I think it focuses on a very small proportion of the problem. I think we need to be trying to understand better how do we not only implement the policies to make PFAS use restrictions happen, but all how do we support companies to actually
Mhm,
implement that? How do we help them understand how do they identify PFAS? How do they phase them out? How much is going to cost them? What are their consumers going to think? So I think we need to be spending more effort trying to reduce the use and reduce the emissions. And I think those types of efforts are going to need to be interdisciplinary. It's not something that I can solve as an environmental engineer, which I think
mhm,
is part of what makes it challenging and why we don't have a lot of that work right now. But I think kind of the greasing of the gears and helping to figure out how companies are actually going to make these use restrictions work, to me, that's the biggest next step.
mhm. What about what's next for you and your own work? What questions are you looking to explore next? Are you looking at some exciting projects that we could learn more from, or anything you can share?
Yeah, and I mean, related to what I just said, I am collaborating with some faculty in our business school here at the University of
Mhm,
St. Thomas, and we've just submitted a proposal to help companies do that, to help
excellent.
develop guidance and framework to help companies understand what this process looks like, what they need to do, the different costs, and the implications of it. So, um, I think that type of work is really needed to bridge the gap between the policy and the successful
Mhm.
implementation of the use restrictions.
Okay.
So I'm
Thank
kinda
you.
trying to pivot it away from the remediation side a little bit more towards the use restriction side.
So we really trying to help people on the ground today who could learn from this and implement changes to their actual business practices, maybe even
Yeah,
to stop the discharge of active pollution, basically.
yeah.
Mhm. No, that's really great. Maybe one in one line, what keeps you hopeful that we will, as a society, one day solve this PFAS crisis?
I think it's really that increasing focus on restricting
Mhm.
PFAS use. I think in the EU and in the US, there's a lot of people and a lot of jurisdictions that are interested in these types of use restrictions, and I think that's gonna continue to evolve, and I think that's where we need to be making a difference.
No, thank you for sharing your valuable feedback and your thoughts in this call. I learned a lot. I'm sure anyone who's listening will also be learning a lot and checking out your incredible work that you've done with your colleagues. Thank you once again for joining us in this discussion, Ali. It was a pleasure, and we can't wait to have you back and talk more about more work that you're doing now with the customers or industrial players, help them reduce their discharge.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.